Paul Davies. Hij is een bekend Australische natuurkundige en publicist. Hij heeft enorm veel boeken gepubliceerd. Onder andere The Mind of God, Forces of Nature, Cosmic Blueprints, de Matter Myth over complexity en complexity. En ik wil graag met hem praten over het ontstaan van het leven en de evolutie van het leven. Mr. Davies, hello, do you hear me?
Yes, and greetings from the high seas in the region of the Galapagos Islands.
Ah, all right. Which is, of course, a very important area in all the respect to Darwin. One interesting thing is actually that Darwin once wrote a letter to Mr. Hooker, where he was talking about the origins of life, and that it could possibly have been emerged in a warm pond filled with ammonia, phosphor, heat, and some electricity. What do you think of that? It was quite interesting that he already in his time was thinking about the origins of life. Don't you think so?
Yes, what is interesting about it is, first of all, he had said at one stage that it is mere rubbish to talk about the origin of life. One might as well talk about the origin of matter. But nevertheless, he went on to suggest his warm little pond. And it contains two crucial elements that have stood the test of time. One of these is that a watery medium was really important, and the other is that some sort of chemical self-assembly would be the key to the path taking us from non-life to life. And those elements have remained to this day.
That was quite interesting because actually there was not very much known. Actually, there was nothing known about DNA and those kinds of elements. The interesting thing is I was when I was studying biology, or not studying at high school actually, they introduced me to the experiment Ray Miller, which is actually sort of experiment that is in the line of this idea of Darwin, wasn't it?
Yes, I met Stanley Miller on one occasion and talked about his experiment with him, and he got the idea during a lecture given by Harold Urey at the University of Chicago, and he thought, well, this was a neat idea, and at the time it seemed audacious to suppose that such a simple experiment could really tell us anything about the origin of life. But he went ahead and he put some gases that they believed at the time were present on the early Earth into a flask and sparked electricity through it for a week. And so this was following along Darwin's idea that a watery medium driven by an energy source would undergo chemical complexification. And somewhat to...
Yeah, it was in fact a very simple mixture of gases. It was
methane, ammonia,
vapor,
hydrogen, and water vapor. And the end result after a week was a sludge of amino acids, which are the building blocks of proteins. And so this looked at the time to be like the first step on a long road to life down which a chemical mixture would be conveyed by the passage of time, so that if one simply kept on doing something like this, you know, maybe for thousands of years, then maybe life in its completeness would emerge. Though I think since then the feeling among astrobiologists who study this is that, of course, these first steps were really important steps, but the real mystery is not how to make the building blocks, but how to assemble those building blocks into the enormously complex structures that even the simplest living things possess.
Yeah, I'm also a content director of a science museum, and we are redoing his experiments. The interesting thing is he did it only for a week. I was so much fascinated by this experiment that we are going to do that for 5 years, actually, in coordination with the University of Eindhoven in the Netherlands. Could you anything expect to come out of that if you do that for 5 years?
Well, it depends what gases you're going to use and what conditions you're going to use. I think making amino acids, we now all agree, is a fairly easy step, and indeed you find amino acids in meteorites. So clearly there are conditions in nature which produce these substances very easily. The hard part, I think, is to make the so-called nucleotides, the basis for the informational molecules like RNA and DNA. And making those has proved much more difficult. And so my hope is that you will be able to, with your experiment, to cast light on the production of those informational molecules rather than the amino acids. But it's going to depend very much on, on what you put into your equipment. What gases will you be using?
Well, actually, we did the same gases as Miller did, simply because we wanted to see what's going to happen if you do it longer than only 1 week. And we don't know, of course, what will come out of that, which is quite, I think, interesting to see if there are complex molecules.
The difficulty is, and if I can just get technical for a moment, making amino acids is fairly straightforward because it is what physicists call thermodynamically favored. It's like a downhill process. But the next step, which is linking the amino acids together to form peptides, which are the chain of molecules that go to make up proteins, that involves removing a water molecule for each linkage between two amino acids. And so, of course, that won't work in a watery medium. So you have to take the amino acids from the Miller-Urey system and put them somewhere dry where the water can be driven off. So the next step is different from the first step. Now, people have tried that. They've tried making these peptide chains. Of course, they get all sorts of complicated things. But the point I want to make, I think, which is the real mystery about life's origin, if you talk to organic chemists, they tell you that almost everything you do when you throw energy at organic molecules is you make tar. You make really a complicated mess. It's very, very hard to make pure organic molecules of the sort that are needed for life, and not just make a tarry mess. And as we know in the kitchen, you know, if you're a bad cook, you end up making something like tar. And the trick is to know how to cook up life as a very, very special subset of organic molecules.
Sorry if I interrupt you. I once spoke to Stuart Kaufman, who wrote a very original book, At Home in the Universe,
yes,
for example.
I know Stuart.
Yeah, and actually the interesting thing is he says if you have enough sort of prebiotic molecules and all the kind of different prebiotic molecules, you just throw them in a sort of soup, they will start generating cycles, and they will start generating new sort of chemical evolution. Actually, he says life must be very common in the entire universe because it's loaded with all kind of organic stuff.
Yes, so he has the notion of what he calls autocatalytic cycles. So this is where a mixture of chemicals operates in such a way as to catalyze the production of more of the same chemicals. So it becomes like a self-reinforcing feedback loop. Now, the problem is there's only one autocatalytic cycle that experimenters know, and that is the cycle we already find inside living things. So like the citric acid cycle in the cell is a good example of an autocatalytic cycle. What has not ever been demonstrated is an autocatalytic cycle in a test tube made from simple components. So I think Stuart Kaufman's ideas are absolutely correct, but it remains a theoretical idea. Now, if you can demonstrate in your experiment an autocatalytic chemical cycle spontaneously emerging from your chemical mixture, well, then I think you're probably on the way to getting a Nobel Prize.
But to be honest, it took Earth a couple of million years to do so. Eh?
Well, that's the problem. We have no idea how long it took life to emerge on Earth. We know that in geological terms it was fairly quick, but it still might have been millions and millions of years. And there's no way that we can tell because the traces of whatever it was that happened have been obliterated a long time ago. And so all we can find is the fossil remains of the first truly living things, but we can't find any fossil evidence of any sort of primordial soup or any prebiotic chemistry. It would be very, very hard to imagine that any of that has survived the test of time.
If you look at the origin of life, it's not particularly necessary that it has emerged on Earth. If I have been speaking to Mayor Greenberg, who is not here anymore, but anyhow, he did a lot of experiments with bacteria in his cellar in the University of Leiden, and he actually sort of proved that bacteria can exist in space for quite a long time without dying. So it very well be possible that life has emerged somewhere else.
I wrote an entire book on this subject in the 1990s because I was an early champion of the idea that life on Earth began on Mars and came to Earth in rocks knocked off Mars by asteroid and comet impacts. And at the time, not many people took this idea seriously, a notable exception being J. Melosh at the University of Arizona. And I gave lectures on this, and people said it was crazy and that there was no possibility that life could survive a journey from Mars to Earth inside a rock. But as you mentioned, Greenberger and others, particularly Gerda Horneck in Germany, have showed, have showed that these microorganisms can indeed survive a journey in space, maybe up to some millions of years. And so now I think everyone accepts the possibility that if life begins on Mars, it will soon come to Earth, and the other way, that life will go from Earth to Mars. These two planets have cross-contaminated each other. They're not quarantined, they're not isolated. If you get life on one, you're going to get it on both. I think that's the case. So we have no idea whether life on Earth began on Mars, or began here on Earth, or came from somewhere else entirely.
Yeah, and what do you think about Greenberg's theory that actually everywhere in space, as we now know, organic molecules are being generated? And he has this idea of comets actually as a sort of vacuum cleaners, collecting those molecules and dumping them on a planet and dumping them into the ocean.
Yes, I think there is no doubt that there's a lot of organic chemistry that takes place in space, and it's now possible to detect organic molecules not only in meteorites but in interstellar clouds. And one of the big surprises when Viking went to Mars in the late 1970s was that it didn't seem to detect any organic molecules on the Martian surface, because you would expect stuff to be delivered from comets and micrometeorites to the surfaces of planets. So the favored view now of the Earth's early history is that once it settled down, once the Earth had first formed, it became coated with a veneer of life-encouraging substances, water and organic molecules. But of course, the general public must understand that when we use this term organic, it doesn't necessarily mean living or the products of living things. It simply means carbon molecules, and some of these molecules are very simple and can be made like you're doing in your lab experiment, or they can be made in space. And of course, it's a long way from simple organic molecules to life itself. So I'm not a great fan of the idea that life itself would form in outer space in quite the conditions that that Fred Hoyle, who I knew very well, worked with many years ago, and Mayor Greenberger might suggest.
No, well, he didn't suggest that it would emerge actually in comets, but he said prebiotic material has been brought by comets to our planet. I was actually wondering, because we are actually carbon machines, and the cosmos is loaded with all kinds of carbon molecules actually. Is there another way that life could emerge? I mean, carbon is abundantly available in the cosmos, so it's quite logic to be a carbon-based life, but would there be another possibility?
Well, some people talk of silicon as replacing carbon as the life-giving element, and that idea was sufficiently popular that it made it to an episode of Star Trek, I don't know if that tells us
Yeah.
anything. When I talk to my chemist colleagues, they're a bit skeptical that you could really do the job with silicon. But, you know, life as we know it requires more than just carbon. Carbon is the key element, but there's also nitrogen, hydrogen, oxygen, phosphorus and sulfur.
Yep.
And of that list of elements, there's one that does stand out as being a little peculiar, and that is phosphorus. It's absolutely crucial both for DNA and for the energy source inside life as we know it, that you have to have phosphorus. But it's a rather rare element, and one wonders if another element could do the job as well. And a colleague of mine, Felisa Wolf-Simon, has suggested that arsenic could do the same job as phosphorus. Now, it turns out that arsenic is actually just as rare as phosphorus, but it does have some properties which might give it an advantage. And so she's busy looking to see if there are any arsenic organisms on Earth. So these would be carbon-based life still, but in which the phosphorus is replaced by arsenic. So that would be an alternative form of life on Earth, life but not as we know it, so to speak. But my own feeling is
But it would be very rare.
Oh, yes, at least you would expect to find it only where you have a lot of arsenic and not much phosphorus. But there are such places. So she's looking at a particular lake in California, and maybe the hydrothermal vents where we know there are organisms living in extreme conditions. Is another place where you might have a lot of arsenic but not much phosphorus. So the story of phosphorus is a bit of a complicated one, because the availability of phosphorus on the Earth depends upon the amount of oxygen in the atmosphere. So back in the early days, it didn't dissolve in the oceans very well, but when the oxygen built up, it led to better availability of phosphorus. So now phosphorus is probably better than arsenic for doing the job. But on the early Earth, arsenic could have been had the advantage over phosphorus. We don't know. It's interesting conjecture.
Yeah, and these days actually, let's say 20 years ago, well, not very many people were assured that there was some life outside Earth. Actually, if you look now, there's an entire field of astrobiology, and it's quite, well, let's say, common good to think that there's definitely life somewhere else in the cosmos, isn't there?
Yes, and this is an extraordinary change, because when I was a student back in the 1960s, I was really interested in this idea of life elsewhere, and people thought I was mad. I might just as well have professed a belief in fairies. Nobody really thought there was any life beyond Earth, no scientists, any life of any sort, let alone any intelligent life. So this was just considered crazy. But over my career, the pendulum has swung the other way, and it's now fashionable to suppose that the universe is teeming with life, but of course we still are no further forward in understanding how life began now than we were back in the 1960s. So this is pure fashion, but it's an interesting fashion, and as you say, there's an entire subject called astrobiology. There are 2 journals devoted to this. NASA has an astrobiology institute. My university is part of that. And I regularly write papers for astrobiology journals. So there's a whole industry of people doing this. It couldn't have existed 30 years ago. And so it tells us something about the scientific process, that this subject is now flourishing.
That's right, and even if you look at, for example, the NASA or the ESA, you see that the search for life is actually one of the most important things that satellites are doing actually at this moment, while also looking at the climate, but anyhow, also sending robots to comets to actually look at stars and look at exoplanets to see if there are signs of life.
It is one of the few things about the space program that the general public fully supports. I think everybody is excited, just as I am, about the prospects for finding life elsewhere. It just seems one of those really deep and important questions that we should all care about. And I think there's a lot of pressure that the public brings to the space agencies to go out there and get some evidence for life. Of course, we may find it by going to Mars, or we may find it by looking at extrasolar planets, the atmospheres of those planets, or we may, if we got really lucky, find some evidence for life in another Martian meteorite. But this is a long, hard struggle, and yet I think it's a worthy one. It's one of those great questions that we all care about.
But do we know where we're looking for? Because it could be quite different from the life we know here.
This is the big problem. You're looking for something which is very different, and you have to make educated guesses. And so one guess that I think is probably an important one is that all life is probably going to have an asymmetry, a lopsidedness between left and right-handed molecules. And so one possible signature of life quite generally is what physicists call chirality, or handedness of these molecules. And so the trick is to figure out how you could measure the chirality of molecules on some remote planet and use that as a way of identifying life. And so I'm working on that problem myself at the moment with Gil Levin, who sent the labeled release experiment to Mars on Viking, and he's an adjunct professor at my center at Arizona State University.
Do you expect, let's say in our lifetimes, in 30 years or something, we will find life somewhere?
Well, I'd love to believe that, but I'm a cautious enough scientist to know that what you want and what may be the case could be very different. But I think we're in with a chance to find some other form of life. But we might find it right here on Earth. We may not need to go to Mars or somewhere else. We might find life has started many times right here on Earth, and we could get evidence like this arsenic life or something else for maybe some form of alien life right here on our home planet. At least it's not so expensive as going to another planet.
No, because of course normal life will find, well, very abundant, but then you mean, for example, the arsenic life?
Yes, I mean an alternative form of life right here on Earth. So this would be life that would have descended from a different genesis. It would be a different tree of life altogether, an alternative type of biochemistry. For example, I mentioned chirality. This would be one in which it would be the mirror image, so the molecules might be reversed. That's one, or maybe it's got arsenic replacing phosphorus, or maybe a different form of informational molecule, or maybe a different suite of amino acids and a different genetic code. All of these differences we could look for among the microbial life here on Earth, which has only just been explored. We've only scratched the surface of the microbial realm. But now I'm getting signs that we should bring this interview to an end because we're running out of time, and I suspect the link will drop out unless we say goodbye.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for your information. I suspect that we will find life somewhere in our own lifetimes. At least we hope. As a scientist, you can have hope as well. Thank you very much, and I hope to talk to you again.
I very much enjoyed it, and good luck with your experiment.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.